Assalamu alaikum, you guys. We're trying this again, and today we are talking about the socialization myth, and it is with Julie Walter, and she's a certified teacher for 16 years, and she's here. So I'm just going to give a quick intro, and then I will have her come on. So she's a teacher for 16 years and has a degree in visual arts. She's a longtime homeschooler. She's taught students from kindergarten through 10th grade, and in her roles included school librarian and special education resource teacher. She's done a lot, so I'm just going to give you a quick summary. She's also taken on a specialized role as teaching kids with severe disabilities. She led forest school pilot programs and has most recently taken up a role as teaching gifted education. She currently teaches a small group of students, children in a puriculture farm in Ontario, Canada. Also, on her online presence, which is Family Eels, that's where she inspires and coaches parents and homeschoolers in particular on how to create more integrated and sustainable family lives. And she's also the host of the Family Eels podcast. And let's bring her on. There she is. Hi, Julie.
Hello. How are you today, Shanila?
Good. How are you?
Good, thank you. Good. Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad you are. You put a post up. I think it was about something about socialization, and then I was like, I want to have you on, and I want to talk about just this topic, socialization, and whether people are sending their kids to school, public school, private school, homeschooled, it doesn't really matter. This is something that applies to all of us. And I think people who do send their kids to school, they're assuming that, okay, well, that's taken care of, that I can just check that off. And the ones who homeschool and who are intentional, they may say that, okay, I've created a way to integrate socialization, so I'll check that off. But there's more to that. So we're going to talk about that. So can we start off with, like, what is socialization anyways? What is your definition of socialization?
I think my definition of socialization is very different than what most people might think. It's really about how to be in the world, how to be a social being, as we are humans, and that's kind of the crux of what we're about, right? We're about relationships. So for me, socialization is about being in relationship with others, whether that's, one-on-one or in group settings or in a work environment. Basically, how do you get along with people?
Yeah. And Susan Weisbauer, she has a book called The Well-Trained Mind. And in it, she has a section, like a couple pages on socialization. And when I read that, I was like, wow, I had no idea. And she said something similar in that how to function in society with other people. We're social beings.
Yeah.
And how do we interact? And there's lots of different ways. School is one way. So it's not just the only way, but it's just one way. So can we talk about just what we were talking about earlier when we were talking one-on-one? And I was like, you know what, this is just mind-blowing, and I want you to share it with everybody else. One of the misconceptions that we have about socialization is that, well, when they go to school, they're going to be socialized. Can you talk about that?
Sure, that's a big can of worms for me, but I think just to backtrack just a bit, I think conventional understanding of what socialization means is to exist in that school environment with same age peer groups. And I think if we unpack that a little bit and we kind of look at the bigger system of us, right, as people in the world, that situation doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. It exists in schools, that you are in groups of, 20 to 30 children. Or peers, if you're, in the teen years, and that you're all the same age and that you have to work it out and get along. So the pieces that carry over are, how do we work it out and get along? The piece that's fabricated, in my opinion, is We need to have kids with same age peers. We need to have kids interacting in large group settings, and that there's like unwritten rules about how you function in the classroom. And so a big part of questioning this for me is like, okay, well, what's the transference then, right? So if we're saying this is how we do socialization, how does that then jump to the real world, right? Because we assume, as you said, we assume that if we send our kids to school, they're going to be learning social skills. Well, if you think about how the school day is, and I know because I taught there for 16 years, you know, the time in the classroom is, you know, you need to sit in your own desk and you need to do your work. Yes, there are times where you put kids in groups and you do group work, but that is not the majority of their day by any stretch of the imagination, unless your child happens to be in an exceptional classroom or some form of alternative education. In the early years, yes, more so, right? The kindergarten, yes, kids are doing play-based education, so they're working with other kids. But as soon as they hit grade 1, they're, you know, seat work, don't talk to anybody, right? Like talk about the opposite of what we hope for our kids. And then recess comes along, you know, they're waiting all day for recess. It comes along and they get sent out onto the schoolyard where there's like a ratio of 200 students to one teacher who's supervising all those kids. And they're pretty much left to their own devices for how to solve their problems and work through things. So some strategies are given to children, usually the same ones, right? Like talk it out. Did you try to talk it out before you came to see me? But the truth of the matter is, like, that teacher on yard duty is really just trying to keep the calm so that they can get through their yard duty rotation, and just carry on with their day. They don't really want to take the time to educate maybe that child they don't even know because they're from somebody else's class. So it's sort of this weird, like, it's not my problem. And those skills are not getting taught. They're definitely not being taught consistently across the board because there's no curriculums for that in schools. It's just assumed. Honestly, it's assumed that kids know how to do that. And so as soon as you move into some of the marginalized learners, right? So kids who have learning disabilities or even our gifted population, they don't have those skills. They can't just uptake them by observing other kids. And so what happens is they need the direct teaching, but the truth of it is all kids do, right? So if you look at the extremities of a population, it tells you a lot about what's happening in between. And so I think socialization needs to be taught, and a lot of it's coming from the home, right? How are the parents dealing with it at home? And then that's what the child's going to bring into school as their go-tos or their ways to solve these problems that happen on the yard.
Yeah. And you know, you said that work it out. That's something that you hear in the playground, maybe even in homeschool settings, in park days, and recess or at school, with family members, with cousins. Say, let them work it out. But do they have the skills to work it out? Because in order to work it out, you have to be self-aware, you have to be present, you have to be an active listener, you have to have empathy, you have to look at the nonverbal cues. Adults don't even do all that. Adults can't even work it out. So how can we expect someone who's 6 or 7 to automatically know? What they do know how to do, I feel like, is that they figure it out, but maybe what they're figuring out is not right. Maybe it's just kind of like, this is what I know to do to get by. Maybe it's actually survival versus like real skills. What do you think?
I fully agree. I'd just like to make an analogy, right? If you compare it to a math problem, well, I'm going to give this child a multi-step math word problem. Maybe the child doesn't know how to read. Maybe the child doesn't understand the problem. Maybe they don't know how to do the computation math to get there because it requires you to do like multi-digit multiplication and they don't even know how to multiply. And, you know, they could come up with some answer and write something down, but it's almost like in our culture, we're saying like, it's okay to just write something down. As long as you write something down, you're good. Instead of going for understanding, instead of going for more of like a root of empathy and understanding others and why behaviors are happening, right? So if some conflict is happening between you and someone else, generally that means there's a miscommunication of some sort. So either needs are not being met or there's not good enough exchange of information between the two parties for people to be able to work it out. And communication takes skill, it takes practice, it takes modeling, and it takes time. right? As you were saying, like a lot of
Yeah.
adults, are still, I'm still working on these skills, right? And if I look at
Mhm.
myself as a parent, the
Yeah.
way that I approach my children, it's like sometimes I'm out of the gate just reactive,
Mhm. Mhm.
wishing, oh man, if I could do a rewind, I would approach that differently,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Or even sometimes we'll say something to our friends, and maybe our friends will take it a different way than we intended it.
Mm-hmm.
Or there'll be some back and forth between adult friends. So imagine like a child who doesn't know. So there may be some children who may have more skills than others. And so do they, even if they're doing something wrong, do they kind of quote unquote win the argument just because they know what to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the other thing that I just wanted to add into this mix is when kids are that little, what's happening is when they have those conflicts and they're not able to resolve them, or they don't come to a resolution that feels fair to them, because kids have such an internal sense of justice, right? So
Mhm.
if that doesn't come to a resolution where it feels good, then they internalize that, right? Just like they do in our parenting, in educational settings, in those social settings, they think it means something about them,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Mhm.
I'm not good enough, right? There's something wrong with me because this person's treating me this way, because they have no outlet for that, and they're not dealing with those deep feelings. Instead, it's like, oh, well, work it out, and then we move on, and now we're doing geography and forget about whatever happened.
Mhm.
And I think that we, in an effort to push forward this socialization, we're actually missing so many opportunities to actually catch the moments, because that's when we can teach socialization. Is like, oh, we see an
Mhm.
interaction between two kids.
Yes.
It's like, oh, you didn't deal with that in a way that was very sensitive to the other child.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in a homeschool setting, as a mom on the playground or in like a co-op or whatever, I can witness that. And then later on, we can come back to it. And I say, oh, I noticed this happen. Like, how do you think you would feel if that was you, or
Yeah.
if someone
Yeah.
said that to you?
Yeah.
Just unpack it. Or, if your child's on the other side of it and something happened to them, like a kid took a toy out of their hand and,
Mhm.
they're younger and they were upset about it, and in the moment, the trajectory of the day kind of like moved it on and you didn't have time, later you can talk about it, like at bedtime, like, oh, how did that feel, and what do you wish would have
Mhm.
happened, what could you do next
Mhm.
time, right? Because that's how we
Yeah.
pattern our brains, is thinking forward to next time. It's like, okay, if I had a
Mhm.
redo, what would I say? And then it gives
Mhm.
our children those skills, right? And
Yeah.
it's not immediate, right? It's not like, oh, we
Mhm.
have that conversation once and now our kid's a rock star.
Yeah.
But having those conversations repeatedly, I feel like it's more available when we're more integrated with our children's lives, right? So when
Yeah.
we're sending our kids away for a schooling environment, we're depending on that environment to provide that socialization. So
Yeah.
either we need to pull that thread through to our home life, and notice how much of that is actually our responsibility because it isn't getting covered very well in the
Yeah.
public education system.
Yeah.
Or we are integrating ourselves into our kids' lives in a homeschool setting, or some hybrid, where we're taking responsibility for those skills
Mhm.
and really overtly teaching them to our kids to give
Yeah.
them what they need, right, to succeed in multiple environments. Right.
Yes. And we're right now we're just focusing on school or just with other kids in that peer to peer. And one of the things I want to say that for people who do have their kids in school, any school settings, one good thing to do is really reach out to the teacher. And if your child brings home something, an issue, or decides that this person keeps saying this to me, or they keep stealing my pencil, whatever it is, going to the teacher and saying, hey, my child is bringing this up. What do you notice? What do you see? And even if she's really busy, she has 20 other kids, but you take the time and effort to connect with the teacher, that next day, she's probably going to make sure she, watches or like looks at your child and make sure that they're okay because you brought it to her attention,
Mm-hmm.
or like something that you're struggling with and bringing the teacher in. And, the teacher could be like, well, I didn't notice anything. I didn't have time. And later on, maybe she'll actually go back and notice and give you feedback. Or let's say the teacher, if it's a really good teacher, obviously, then they're going to see if that's really an issue with all the other kids and maybe alter something or change something. So there's always something that we can do even if we're not there. And also, like you said, in home situations or like in homeschool situation, we have park days, play dates, a lot of social interaction. And we can't just say, okay, everybody go to the park and that's it. But talking to our kids, conversing with them, and maybe just looking in that direction, seeing if, oh, there's a kid who's just sitting alone in the swing and everybody else is somewhere else. I may go, maybe going up, like I'll go to my kids and say, hey, I noticed that one girl, she's kind of on her own, and my daughter might say, oh, we went up to her and she wanted to kind of do her own thing. Or, oh yeah, I didn't notice. Okay, we'll include her too. So that's something that parents, we have to be aware of and do that, whether it's at school, at the park, at a family gathering, or at just anywhere else where there are other kids. Are our kids including the new kids? Are our kids going, being aware of that? Because they're just kids, they don't know, but we're adults, so we can bring that awareness to our kids.
Yeah, for sure. Something else that's a really important piece of that is modeling, right? So when we go into a social setting and our kids are nearby, I will be the one who goes and talks to somebody who nobody's talking to. And I will overtly say it, like, this is the part that a lot of parents miss, I think, is our willingness to be transparent in our thinking. So to say, just before I leave and I go over to talk to that family, I might say, you know what, that family looks like they're standing by themselves. If that was me, I'd feel like it was difficult to join. So I'm going to go over there and talk to them. So just like that little sentence, and then it clicks for the kid, right? Oh, that's why mom's doing that, right? So we give them that internal thinking. This is something that teachers use a lot in literacy when we're teaching kids how to read. Like, I will read aloud to the kids and I'll tell them about what I'm thinking about as I'm reading. But I use that strategy in social skills teaching as well, because why not, right? Like, that's how they can learn, by seeing the transparency in my thoughts. The other thing that I like to do with my kids is, if I was approaching a situation, whether it be a day at school or day at the park or whatever, we might talk about like what's coming up. Like, oh, let's say we get to the park and, somebody's on the swing and you want to be on the swing. What could you do about that? So just that pre-thinking too, especially for kids who have anxiety, or it would be difficult for them if they're more shy and they wouldn't want to speak up. Just equipping them with that, oh, if this is happening, this is what I could do. Maybe as the parent, you've seen similar patterns happen before, where the child, always goes and there's somebody on the swing and they just stand there for a long time. Because what ultimately we want is for our kids to be able to do these things independently. So if we have that pre-teaching, right, in the car ride on the way there, it doesn't have to be like a big spiel. It's just like, again, 1 or 2 sentences. Oh yeah, I noticed last time you didn't get a turn on the swing. What do you think you could do when you get there? How could you ask? Let's practice. Tell me like I'm the person who's on the swing, right? And give them that opportunity to try it out with somebody who's safe, and so that it feels more comfortable to step into that. And just to go back to the example you were speaking about in the classroom, just to throw it out there as an idea, to again help our children with that autonomy, to help them kind of bridge the gap and be able to show up for themselves. Because that's part of social skills, right? If you don't show up for yourself, then you don't understand how to show up for others. But then also the relationship suffers, because you may be martyring yourself, right? In an effort to like make something work. For me, teaching my kids how to show up for themselves is just as important for having empathy for others. And I feel like they go together hand in hand. So just to go back to that classroom example, you had mentioned like maybe you could phone the teacher and say like, this is going on, da, da, da. I would ask my own kid, well, have you spoken to the teacher yet? And if my child says no, they haven't, I would unpack that. Like, why? Does it feel uncomfortable for you to do that? And again, role play. Well, what could you say to the teacher? What could you say to this other kid? And yes, those things don't work, you're going to go get help. So my call to the teacher might be, hey, I've been unpacking this at home with my child. Please expect them to come and talk to you. I'm going to call you tomorrow to find out if they talk to you. Because then we're getting our kids to do the work, and they're getting them to do the legwork. And then the teacher, doesn't have to act on it right away. They can just be an observer to the situation. they can kind of grow an awareness of what's happening. And as well, our child can grow awareness of, oh, this is how I can show up in this difficult situation. The
Yeah.
teacher knows about it. And so then all of a sudden the
Yeah.
interface is a little bit different.
Exactly. I love that. And I do that with my middle schooler and above, especially because now you're giving them more, even if it's an online class and it's like, okay, I didn't get that attachment, you know, and everybody else did. And then you say, well, you can email the teacher if there's an issue. Sometimes I'll email the teacher on the side and say the same thing, that, you know, I asked her to email you directly.
Yeah.
And so she's kind of has that awareness that, okay, she's looking out for that.
Yeah.
And
but even our little ones, right? Like sometimes we don't give them enough credit. Like a kid who is 6 or 7 is quite capable of going to the teacher and saying, you know, so-and-so is doing such and such to me.
Exactly.
And I think the more we can grow brave children,
Mm-hmm.
right? The more they have that courage and that willingness to show up, then the more they're actually growing social skills.
Yeah.
Right?
And if they're shy and they're like, oh, I don't want to, you do it, then go with them.
Mm-hmm.
And you do it, and then eventually they'll do it on their own, and they'll feel heard. And another important thing about just social skills, and not telling our kids to just be like, oh, just get along, or just, you know, it's okay, just, you know, kind of silencing them, but just really listening. But also because they may be coming to us with small problems that's in our mind, small. That's not a big deal for us, but for them, that's their big deal.
Yeah.
And if we can, yes, we can navigate that with them and help them, they'll feel empowered, brave. And also, I'm noticing that even with my daughter, she's 11, and even with younger kids, especially with homeschooling or not, it doesn't matter, but they're learning boundaries. And I read about boundaries as an adult, and I'm just like, wow, I didn't even know this was a thing. And I'm able to teach my daughters that. And that comes with socialization, is that everybody has boundaries. And it's tricky because what is somebody else's boundary? You don't know, and you have to communicate to really understand that, and have empathy and be present and be mindful. And those are so many things that we're working on throughout our life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think
and somebody asked about, can you talk about socializing with regards to siblings?
Yes. I'll just finish this thought first.
Yes.
Because that idea of learning about boundaries and learning how we are interfacing with others, that's really what socialization is. And I'll tell you that teaching is not happening in the majority of schools. I can't say all schools, but the majority of the schools, that's not actually what's being taught, right? Problem solving strategies sometimes, right? Like we're going to try these multiple different things, and if they don't work, then, you know, this is what we'll try instead. That whole problem solving model, make a plan and then review the plan, that gets taught. But very rarely are kids taught these are the things that might be included in a plan. And then the other thing just about boundaries is it's not easy. Even for adults, boundaries are not easy. They're always moving, they're always in flux, and they completely rely on the relationship, right? So again, go back to what socialization actually is. It's like, how are we relating to other people? So my boundary on a day when I have a headache about noise is going to be completely different than if we're outside at the park, right? So having kids understand that and understand kind of the relationship between two people, I would say actually, just to answer that question, is the foundation of sibling relationships. Because if we can understand, ourselves, that different people are going to react different ways depending on where they're at and all the things going on for them, then we can build more empathy for what they're doing. I actually just had a conversation with my daughter this morning because I watched her get angry at her oldest brother for doing a certain thing. And then when her middle brother did it to her, she was all up in arms. And so I said to her, I was like, okay, first I felt it with her, right? You got to honor the feelings. And that also doesn't happen in schools. So parents who are sending their kids to school, please be mindful to hold space for your kids' feelings. Like you were saying, Shanila, we really need to allow them that to feel heard first. But anyway, after feeling the feelings with her and allowing her some space to be with that, it was like, okay, let's just draw a parallel here. Because wasn't that the same thing pretty much that just happened? Yeah, but okay, but let's look at what's happening, because there's thoughts, and then our thoughts or our feelings are driving the behaviors. So sure, the behavior is not okay, right? Like when your brother comes and he, you know, kicks over your Lego thing, that's going to make you really angry,
Mhm.
understandably. But you can't go back and yell at him or, you know, whatever the thing is. So having the kids kind of dig under that and be like, oh, what do you think? Like, why do you think you would behave that way? Doesn't
Yeah,
excuse the behavior. Like those are two separate things, right? The
exactly.
behavior can be completely off color, right? Like just not
Yes.
okay. And yet that child is trying to meet a need. So the more we can unpack with our children about what the underlying needs are,
Mhm.
away from the emotional stuff, right? Because they can't
Mhm.
do it in that state. Like their brain just can't do it. But, you know, maybe later that day or the next day, and be like, what do you think was going on there? And just really
Yeah,
getting curious and doing the same thing with them. So again, what I said, like where our internal boundaries are really related to the boundaries of others. Right. And the more we understand ourselves, the more we can understand others. And it kind of,
yeah,
it dovetails
exactly.
together. Yeah.
And sometimes the kids will say that, well, and it takes time because the kids will tell us things once they're thinking. So we're just like, we're basically coaching them.
Yeah.
We're coaching them and working with them through their emotions and feelings and what was going on. And then we're helping them unpack it. So then they're kind of like, oh yeah, I think I was just hungry, actually. You know? So when they realize that about themselves, and like we can't expect them to know themselves and know all their triggers, know everything that's going on in that heat of that moment.
Yeah.
But when we give them space, like you said, then it makes sense for them to be able to reflect on what just happened. And especially with siblings, that's siblings and our parents, our family life, that's a blueprint for relationships. And later on, we kind of try those things and it doesn't work on a random person. It doesn't work on, I remember me doing things at home and it was like, okay, whatever. But me doing it with my roommate and it was embarrassing, you
Mm-hmm.
know? And
Yeah.
so I think we're not in constant relationship when we're outside of the house with somebody. We're at home, we are. And a home is supposed to be a place where we can just be able to fall apart, be ourselves, and just like, sit back, relax, and not have to be, like thinking like, okay, I don't want this person to judge me. What is the right thing to do? And that's when our true self really comes out. That's who we really are at home with our kids and our kids with us. And when we go out and we're with others, whether it's at the grocery store, it's at a friend's house, it's at our grandparents' house, sometimes we automatically as adults, and I don't know if you do this, but I realized this recently, is that I act different because there's a set that, in society, there's a set thing that you're supposed to do or not supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we're better outside. We're better with relatives or the person at the grocery store than we are at home with our siblings and our family, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think parents and homes get the worst of their kids, right?
Mhm.
And that's because kids can let it all hang out, right? There's a reason too why when kids go away to school, when they get home from school, they're just having meltdowns, right? Like there's like a name people call it, but basically like the unraveling after you return
Yes,
home from somewhere. It's just like, now I can just like
let it
unload
all.
up the things that I've been shoving down all day. And I think it's a safe space for them, right? Where they can be their emotional selves and know that we're going to love them anyway. And our schooling environments are very much not that, because if you step out of line, you're going to get shamed, or you're going to get bullied, or you're going to get whatever, even a dirty look, right? Those things all get internalized. And so when kids come home and they're just melting down at the end of the day, it's like that's the time where we can hold space for those feelings and allow that to come through. But also too, just to be parental models for that too, right? Because we don't keep it together all the time, right? And
Yeah.
sometimes we make mistakes socially. And so again, with that thinking aloud, just being like, oh, like if I yell at my kids, I will say to them, you know what? I am really sorry. Like, firstly, I'll take a break, right? Deal with my emotional stuff. When I come back, I'm really sorry. Like, that is, nobody deserves to be yelled at. My behavior was unacceptable. this is what's going on for me. I'm hungry, I'm tired, whatever. That is not an excuse for my behavior, and I apologize for my behavior. I need to deal with things for myself right now, right? So any of that we can bring to the kids, right, where we can separate the needs and the behavior, the more we can tease that apart, the more language we're giving our kids, and
Yes.
also more awareness for what's coming into them,
Yeah.
right? So when we, send them to school and they, they come upon somebody who's not being nice to them, it's like, wow, my first response for my kids is always like, wow, that child is really struggling.
Yeah.
What do you think they must be going through if that's what you're getting, right? Like, because you're getting everything that doesn't fit in their cup, right? And so again, building that empathy and that understanding, and also some distance, right? Like, we don't need to take that personal just because that person laying
and right away we have to correct it. And sometimes we feel like, oh, right away we have to do something. We step back. And when we model that at home, imagine our kids maybe like 15, 16, and they're having a bad day and they kind of go off on one of their friends. And they model that to their friend. They go take a 5-minute break and come back and say, I'm sorry. Like, that was out of line. I'm sorry. So whatever we learn at home, we tend to do that with others in our society, right? So imagine the opposite. Imagine as a parent, I'm dismissive and I'm just like, okay, whatever, get over it. It's not a big deal. And then something happens with my friend and they're trying to talk to me. And then I say, okay, it's not a big deal. It's okay. Let's, whatever. And you see that being modeled. So it brings it back to me and what I'm modeling. And not only because we need help too, right? We were just talking about that. We're not perfect. We get it wrong all the time. But every time we say it out loud and verbalize it, like, oh, that was hard. Like, what just happened? Like, and then you take responsibility for your part instead of like, oh, well, you did that. And that happens with siblings a lot, right? Where, oh, you did that or she did that. That's why, we blame them. Instead, why not just take a responsibility for my part? So I might say, guys, I'm sorry for my part, and I yelled. And eventually later on that will trickle down and they may say that, okay, well, I'm going to take responsibility for my part. And I think a big part of socialization is the rupture and repair. And that's part of relationship. That goes back to relationships. And so again, we're going back to the family unit of what we're modeling, how we are interacting with each other. And it spills over to when we're with our grandparents, when we're with our cousins, when we're with our friends or somebody at the grocery store, at school. And I think all of these components is what real socialization is about. So the myth is really that it happens only in school or with, your friends, but really it's with everyone. And we talked about siblings, we talked about at schools and our home. What are other areas where socialization actually occurs and we can take advantage of?
Yeah, anything, everywhere, right? Anytime you're in
grocery store.
People. And then, some of the environments that we're operating in now are a bit of a stretch because we're in online environments a lot. And the socialization that happens in online environments is very, very different. You're missing a lot of what you get in face-to-face interaction. If it's voice only, you don't have facial expressions and body language to go off of, which is the majority of our understandings actually speak to others. And then in addition to that, there's just an exchange between people that you just don't, it's just not the same when you're online. And then that's like a whole other topic about, educating our children about online socialization because people can put things out there and not, see the reaction of what they're putting out into the world. They think the reaction is not happening. They're just like, oh, I'll just put this out, all's well. And they forget there's real people on the other end.
Yes, exactly.
And so
a really quick tip for that is really to use emojis, because sometimes when we don't, that shows the different emotions. So the least we can do is that, end it or start it with emojis, because that kind of shows you that feeling part of it, because you don't even see that person.
It's true. Although, an emoji, it will get you so far, right? So, you know, something I talk to my family about is there's certain conversations that we just don't have online.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like there needs to be boundaries there as well. Like this is what may or may not go well in an online environment. So there's
Or just
also,
messaging
you
each
know,
other, like messaging each other too,
yeah,
because if you're having a serious conversation, then pick up the phone or do the FaceTime where you're interacting with that person, because so much of it is nonverbal.
yeah. And people are so hesitant to do that, right? Like so much communication happens through text these days.
Yeah.
And I feel
Yeah.
like a lot gets lost in translation. And so we can also relieve ourselves a little bit from the frenzied pace of texting, you know, and model for our kids. Well, what does it look like to have an engaged social interaction? So we have to always be mindful of like what we're doing in the presence of our kids, right? Are we just trying to fire off a poorly spelled text to somebody to get it off our plate, or are we willing to make space for the people in our lives? And how does that relate to your family values and what you want for your family, and how you want your kids' interactions to be with others? Because if we're not willing to put the work in ourselves for our friendships and our family, then we can't expect our kids to do that too. Right? So again, it's always cyclical, always comes back. Speaking of cycles, I want to cycle back a little bit on the sibling thing. I just had a couple ideas that came to me. For people who are looking for like practical things about that, I would say just try to slow the tempo. Again, going back to that texting thing, right? We need to slow down enough to give space to the feelings that need to come and move through. So if my kids are having a fight, I generally try to like separate them and give them their own breathing room, and then have the conversation when kids are calmed down. Again, talking about that personal responsibility, like what parts of this can I own? What could I have done differently? Because in an altercation, everybody's always got something, right? Like there's stuff on both sides. And then the other thing, just apart from that, and then like finding solutions together, is something that really helps if you're having a lot of sibling rivalry in your house, is to give individual attention to each of your kids. It doesn't have to be a lot, like just 5 minutes, read a book to one child. You know, maybe the other kid really loves Lego. Just get down on the floor with them for 5 minutes, you know, undivided. It really just brings the temperature down so that the kids aren't vying for that. Anytime we're having that eruptive emotion stuff, it's meaning that there's a need that's not being met. So that need is usually connection, but not always. Sometimes it's other things, like we mentioned, hunger. Maybe they're tired. Maybe they've been eating food that's not, you know, in their normal diet, et cetera, et cetera. So just to cycle back on that. But now I've lost the track of what we were saying.
So the two things that you mentioned right now, especially with siblings, and that models, you know, socialization in other areas and environments. But both of those things, Julie, takes time. If you are in a tight schedule where you're like, okay, at 3 o'clock I have to do this, 3:15, 4, 7, you miss that. You don't have time for it.
Yep.
It takes time. That's the thing.
And
nobody has time.
To do it in the moment, right? And it also takes time over the span of their childhood. So like this is like parenting for the long game, right? It's not like, okay, we do this once and then my child understands how to do this. This is dealing with emotional responses. And our emotions do take time. And just to go back to what I said about the texting, it's like in our digital cultures now, I don't think we leave enough time for the humanness.
Yeah.
Because it's like, got to get the text sent off, got to make the plan, got to get the kid to soccer, then we got to get home and get lunches packed for the next day, and. So if you look at that as a system, where is the room in that system for the humanity, for feeling, for the socialization, for allowing ourselves to have that push and pull of what like real relationships are about and feel like, right? If we expect the relationship to function as a machine, then it will. Machines aren't very fun to hang out with, right? They're not super satisfying to be around. So we have to allow ourselves time for the process, you know, and allow ourselves time to be messy and to get it wrong and to learn as we go, right? Not expect, you know, that, you know, I think a lot of us, me included, like I think I've read, I don't know, this is an example. I read like every book there is on infant sleep, because when my kids were little, I wanted them to sleep through the night, and I
I did
So I
too.
knew I wasn't going to figure it out, right? So I read all the
Yeah.
books. They didn't help. It wasn't like, we always are looking for that one-stop shop. It's like, oh, if I just find the right piece of information, then I
Exactly.
pick the box and everything's going to be smooth sailing.
Mm-hmm.
The problematic thinking there is we're actually dealing with human systems. Human systems are messy. Human systems are relational. Human
Yeah.
systems are dynamic. And when
And
we want to
complicated.
yeah, they're complicated. When we want to
Yeah.
apply this salve to be like, oh, well, this is just going to fix everything, then we don't serve our children and we don't serve ourselves, and we don't serve their future, right? Because it takes time to develop these skills and to understand
Mm-hmm.
how to be humans in the world, right? And how to be
Mm-hmm.
social beings. And I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of us are still figuring that out, to be frank,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like even
Yeah.
adults, we're figuring out what does it actually
Yeah.
mean to be
Yeah.
social beings and
And I
to,
think that changes, right, with our relationship. So the relationship that kids have with each other, it changes, it evolves. Their interest changes, but then they may reconnect later on, or they may not. Same with us. Our relationship with, and I'm thinking my relationship with one of my aunts was very different when I was younger, or when I had little kids versus now.
yeah.
And it's fluid. It's not just one and rigid, and it's just always changing. So, and because we're changing, our understanding is changing. We're growing. And when we talk about socialization, we just think of, okay, our kids being with other kids, our kids being together. So when we go to the park, they're mingling and they're not just sitting by us and sitting there like, okay, I don't even know how to talk to people. And I think that's the myth that people have with homeschooling, is that, they think that, well, how do kids interact with others? Because they need to do that.
Yeah.
And
It's the number one
I
question
found that, yeah. And
in
so
your house.
one time my aunt asked me that, and she was really concerned that my kids aren't socialized. And so we were talking about socialization, and I was like, okay, you have older kids, and really socialization is what you're complaining about, that they never spend time with you. They're always with their friends. And like, that's socialization. you know, I really want my kids to be intentional about where they are and who they're with, and making sure that they can sit here with you and be able to talk to you and have a conversation with you, because you have a lot of wisdom to give. And be able to talk to little kids and their peers as well, their own kids, the kids their age, where they may have similar interests, but also little kids who are 2 or 3, and they can actually interact with them and play with them.
Yeah.
And she was like, okay, I'm totally sold on this, and I'm at peace, because yes, that's really what socialization is, and I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why most people only think of socialization as same age peer groups in schools, is because they've never stopped to ask the questions, right? It's like, well, what is that socialization that's actually happening in schools? And is that the be all end all, right? Is that everything? Or do they need further skills to that? Because as you mentioned earlier, we do put on different masks depending on what situation we're in. We have that ability as social beings to show up differently. Like how I show up with my group of friends is very different than how I show up in the workplace, and is very different than how I show up as a parent. And the nuance of that is something that takes a lifetime to learn. And also the attention paid to it, to be like, oh, right, this is something that we have to keep talking about, because it's not static, right? And so again, to apply that metaphor, it's like, well, we're trying to mechanize socialization, where we just send the kids to school, they go into these same age peer groups, and then when they come out, they're socialized, they know what to do. It's like, well, that's not actually how it happens. Some kids are going to come out with great social skills. Other kids are going to be even more quiet and reclusive because they weren't heard in that environment, right? So it just depends on people, like how each individual is relating to that, right?
Yeah. And usually in the work field, as they get to be adults and they're working in different environments, nobody's the same age. You're working with people who are older than you and younger than you, and different personalities. So I think the socialization, it's really important. And if we can nurture that in our kids and help them develop those things, you talked about empathy, having a relationship, being in relationship with others, that's what socialization is. And even at the grocery store, if I go and it's the same people and I'll say, oh, I wonder, I'll say that, we always see this person. I should know what their name is. And then starting this relationship with random person at the grocery store that you always go and they kind of learn to know, you get to know you and you get to know them. And how do you go from somebody who's being a stranger to someone who eventually becomes close to you in that setting where they're like, oh yeah, you know what? There were 2 more strawberries left and I know you were coming, so I just saved it for you. How do you get to that? And they get to see us socialize with strangers and how they become kind of friends. And modeling that, we talked about modeling, whether it's at home with our own friends, with relation to, even our spouses, how we are interacting with them, being and vocalizing. And I really like that you gave an example of just kind of saying that, oh, I need a minute. Or just verbalizing, hey, you know what? I see that mom over there and I think she's new. I don't know if she, maybe I'll go up to her and I'll talk to her. So just saying that out loud kind of helps the children internalize something.
Yeah, and to see what we're doing, right? Because
exactly.
That's the assumptions that are made in school, is like, oh, you're going to see me do that and then automatically you're going to know what I'm doing. But I feel like we lose something when we don't just say it, when we don't overtly teach it. We're assuming they're picking up or even paying attention, and they might have no clue about what we're doing. So if we just give them that and allow them to kind of take on and uptake what we're offering, instead of just hoping that they get it, I think that's where, the socialization in schools really doesn't transfer, because it's that very thing. It's just like, put it out there and we hope the kids just get it by being around other kids their age. Well, I guess my question is, do you want your kids learning social skills from same-age peers who have equally inept skills, or would you like them to be learning social skills from you as an adult who's at least doing work towards becoming more social, or at least has more life experience, right? I feel like so much of it depends on our own inner work, right? Like, how much are we paying attention to ourselves and what's going on with us? Again, right? It's always 2 sides of the same coin. What's happening for us is how well we can relate to others. That goes for us as parents. That goes for us in our social relationships. And therefore, like, how much we're able to teach our kids.
This is a great conversation. I'm so glad we were able to do this, Julie. If anybody has any questions, you can message either one of us. And we really like we talk about this, and sometimes if I have a question, I'll just message you about it. And we haven't even, this is a big topic. There are books about this. So 1 hour doesn't do justice. So definitely we'll have to do this again.
Yes, it was really, really great to speak with you. And I can talk about this all day. It's something near my heart. So thanks for having me on.
Can you tell us about your podcast before you leave and where people can follow you?
Sure. My biggest platform is Instagram, so you can follow me at Family Yields. My podcast centers around permaculture, which is something we didn't really talk about, but I'll just give a quick synopsis. Permaculture is really using the systems of nature to inform how we are acting as humans. As we are part of nature, we can learn from natural systems and then apply that to ours. So I didn't get into it today, but there's a lot of reasons why what we're talking about here is related to how, forests work. So I do a lot of talking about that. So my podcast is really trying to draw connections between our social environments or our human systems and permaculture principles. So my podcast is really focusing on that. On my platform, I talk about parenting as well as homeschooling, as well as inner work, because as you can tell, I really feel like those things are so integrated. And so for me, I really love to talk about integrated family life. How do we fit into our family system? How do our children fit into that system? And how we can make it regenerative as well as uplifting and joyful in a place where we want to be.
Exactly.
Spend time. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Julie. Next time we're going to talk about that in our life. Thank you so much again. And if you guys have any questions again, please let us know, DM us, and we'd love to talk to you. Thanks, Julie. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Assalamu alaikum, you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed that. There's so much about socialization and also just as Muslims, you know, we're social beings and how we interact with others, especially within our families. And that's something that I talk about a lot within our families and modeling, because I really feel like the social framework is from our family. So the way we interact with our kids, we are giving them the blueprint of relationships, social relationships. So inshallah, we will have more speakers, and we're going to talk about what she just talked about, the paraculture and also socialization soon. And if you guys have any questions, you can always DM me. And if you have ideas for other lives and other people who you think would be great to come and we can talk about different topics related to parenting and kids, then please DM me. Assalamu alaikum.